Welcome to The Explainer. Back in 1960, REITs were literally just a footnote. I mean, an obscure tax structure that absolutely nobody's broker was talking about. Fast forward to today, we're looking at a multi-trillion-dollar global asset class. So what on earth happened in between? Well, it basically comes down to one major tax law and the slow death of two incredibly stubborn myths. Myths that, by the way, are probably costing you money right now. Seriously, are you losing money to these two REIT myths? If you've been sitting on the sidelines because you think they're way too risky, or maybe you just view them purely as a defensive, boring play, you're actually missing out on a highly robust and, frankly, lucrative asset class. It's so easy to get shaken out by scary headlines, but we need to look past that at the structural reality of how these assets actually work. Let's take a quick look at how we got here. So, 1960, the US Congress officially sanctions the REIT structure. But honestly, it was just a niche vehicle. Sure, they could own property, but legally they couldn't really manage it. And because of that, top-tier real estate talent stayed far away. Then, boom, the 1986 Tax Reform Act hits, and it completely changes the game. Suddenly, REITs were allowed to internalize their management. They could do their own leasing, their own maintenance, the whole shebang. Because of that shift, real management talent flooded in, quality absolutely skyrocketed, and REITs exploded into the multi-trillion-dollar mainstream asset class you know today. Knowing that historical arc is absolutely crucial because it tells you REITs aren't just some passing fad, right? They are a mature structure with over 60 years of serious stress testing. Just look at Singapore. S-REITs only launched there in 2002, and today, they represent a massive $104 billion market. To put that into perspective, they make up roughly 10% of Singapore's entire listed stock market. That is a massive institutional-grade anchor. All right, let's dive into myth one. REITs are high risk. Let's actually break down that exact risk profile. Think about your everyday DIY private landlord versus a highly regulated S-REIT. Direct ownership historically relies on a ton of leverage, right? A private investor might put down, say, 25% and just load up on uncapped leverage, sometimes up to a 75% loan-to-value ratio. Plus, they usually have highly concentrated tenant risk. If you have one residential tenant and they leave, your rental income literally drops to zero overnight. Now, contrast that with an S-REIT. They have strict structural limits on debt, and their tenants, totally different ballgame. We're talking diversified multinational powerhouses, banks, government agencies, global logistics firms. And they're locked into multi-year contracts across dozens of properties. That's real, tangible downside protection that most standard stocks just don't offer. Actually, let's do a quick check here. Singapore REITs gearing is legally capped at what percentage? 50%. Now, does your neighbor with 3 heavily mortgaged shop houses face that same legal cap? No way. This 50% regulated ceiling acts as a massive structural shield. It prevents the kind of speculative, over-leveraged blowups that completely wipe out private developers during economic downturns. This asymmetry is exactly why the whole REITs are risky narrative gets the story completely backwards. The regulated vehicle is often way safer than the DIY landlord. Moving right along to myth 2, REITs are just an inflation hedge. Now, check out this quote from Jeff Durman, the CEO of Institutional Real Estate. He points out that REIT cash flows tend to be more defensive than most other cash flows, and they're defensive on the downside. And you know what? He's totally right. Rents are contractual, they ratchet up with inflation, and they act as a fantastic shock absorber for your portfolio. But here's the catch. It's only a half-truth. And buying into just half the truth, that's exactly what ends up costing you money. So here's the other half. The reality is that REITs operate on a 2-gear engine. Gear 1 is that inflation protection we were just talking about. But Gear 2? That is economic growth capture. See, when the economy expands, businesses hire more people, they lease more space, and occupancy tightens up. Because demand is so high, landlords can push those rental rates well beyond standard inflation. So investors who treat REITs purely as some defensive corner to hide in, they end up selling them exactly when this powerful growth gear is about to engage. I like to think of a quality REIT as an umbrella that somehow grows in the sun. It shelters your portfolio when inflation reigns, but it literally photosynthesizes when the economy shines. Here's a perfect historical example for you. After that 1986 tax reform we talked about, US REITs compounded roughly 10 to 12% annually, straight through the 1990s boom. And that wasn't despite the economic growth, it was because of it. It's defense that actually scores goals. All right, let's do a quick myth-busting recap. You might have started this explainer thinking REITs were some risky gamble or just a boring defensive inflation hedge. Well, consider both of those myths officially busted. You now know how the 1986 Tax Reform Act professionalized the whole industry. Myth 1? Shattered by strict structural rules, like that 50% statutory gearing cap and rock-solid multinational tenants. Myth 2? Completely dismantled by the two-gear engine that dynamically captures both inflation and economic growth. With this structural understanding in your back pocket, you can confidently hold REITs through those scary headlines that shake out the uninformed investors. In our next explainer, we're going to dive into exactly how a REIT grows your money, looking at internal versus external growth engines and that magical 3% spread that minced shareholder value. But before you go, ask yourself, knowing the built-in structural shields and growth engines of modern REITs, can your current portfolio really afford to ignore them?